good to see you again. We are going to have more missionary adventures today. Where are we going today, Charlie?
Yay! We're going to Taylor Park!
Yeah, Taylor Park is lots of fun, but actually our missionary story today starts off in a different place in Ireland. Let's find out where we're going today. Maybe you go to your mum and you say, "Mum, can I have some ice cream?" And it's just before dinner and she says no. Maybe you go to your dad and you say, "Dad, there's this new PlayStation game out. Can I have it?" And he says no. Is the answer no always a bad thing? Well, today we're going to find out the answer in our story. And it starts off with a young girl called Amy Carmichael. She was born in 1867, which is a long time ago. It's over 150 years ago. And she was born in Missionary, which is a little village just outside Belfast in the north of Ireland. Amy lived beside the sea and she loved it. She loved to hear the waves crashing. She loved the smell of the sea and she loved the colour blue. It was her favourite colour, the colour of the sea. Her mum had blue eyes and they were the bluest eyes that she'd ever seen. And Amy longed to have blue eyes just like her mum. Amy had brown eyes. I wonder what colour your eyes are. Maybe you've got blue eyes. Maybe you've got brown eyes. Maybe you have green eyes. Well, Amy's eyes were brown and she really wanted to have blue eyes just like her mum. Well, when Amy was a young girl, her mum and dad always told her about Jesus. And she went to church every Sunday and every night before they went to bed as a family, she was the oldest of 7 children, they would read from the Bible and they would pray and they would talk to God. And Amy's mum always told her that God hears and answers prayer. And Amy believed that, because she was told how God is powerful, how God is the strongest of all, how God is able to do anything, that he is God, that he made everything, that he controls everything, and he is the most powerful. And Amy believed that. And one night she went to bed, she was just 3 years old, and she knelt down and she prayed, and she asked God to turn her brown eyes into blue eyes. She believed that God could answer her prayer. And she got into bed and she fell asleep. And the next morning she woke up. She was so excited. She jumped out of bed. She ran to a chair. She pushed the chair against the wall and she stood up and she looked in the mirror. Her eyes were still brown. And she was so shocked and she was so upset. And she thought, what happened? Did God not hear me? Why did God not answer my prayer? Mum always told me that God hears and answers prayer. And she stood on the chair and she was trying really hard not to cry. And she sat down and she was really, really upset. She was so disappointed. And she thought, why did God not answer my prayer? And as she sat there and as she thought about it, she thought, well, no is an answer. Has God said no to my prayer? And she thought, well, no is an answer. You see, that day, God had said no to Amy's prayer because many years later, Amy would need to have those brown eyes instead of those blue eyes. You see, many years later, Amy went to a different country to be a missionary. She loved God. She wanted to tell people about Jesus. And so she went to India, which is a really big country, to tell people there about Jesus. And missionaries have many different jobs. There are many missionaries in different countries around the world today. Even in Ireland, we have lots of different missionaries. And if you follow Jesus and you tell people about Jesus, then you too are a missionary just where you are, in school, in your housing estate, among your family. You too can be a missionary for God. Well, Amy was a missionary in this big country called India. It was much bigger than Ireland. And in India, the people spoke a different language. They spoke Tamil. In fact, in India, they had over 700 different languages. And in India today, many of those languages are still spoken. And Amy learned the language Tamil, which was the language that people used where she lived in India. And she was learning the language, and India was so different from Ireland. It was a much bigger country. It was much hotter. It was warmer. The people dressed differently. They ate different food. And she was really trying to understand the way that Indian people lived. What did they believe? Did they know anything about God? Had they seen Bibles before? Had they heard about the Lord Jesus Christ? Did they know that Jesus died on the cross? Did they know that Jesus could forgive them for their sins and give them new life? And Amy just wanted to tell them this good news and this message of the gospel that they needed to hear. But Amy was just settling in, getting used to the language, getting used to living in a different place. And Amy knew that she was from a different country. She was not an Indian. She looked differently. She had pale skin, and the people in India had this lovely soft brown skin. And she spoke a different language. Initially, she spoke English, and they spoke all different languages. And Amy just longed to know more about them. She loved them. She wanted to tell them about Jesus. In India, the people worshipped in these big temples, and these big temples were everywhere. And inside these temples, there were many different gods that were statues, and the people worshipped them. But Amy longed to go inside the temples to find out, what did the people do when they got in there? What did they believe in? Who did they pray to? And she knew that she couldn't go in the way that she was. She knew that she needed to disguise herself. And so one day she thought, I really need to disguise myself so that I will be able to go into the temple, that I will be able to find out more about what the people believe. And one day she got some coffee. Maybe your mum drinks coffee. Got some here. She took some coffee, and it's a lovely soft brown colour. So she crushed it up and she put coffee powder on her face, on her arms, so that her skin would look a lovely soft brown colour, the same colour as the Indian people's skin. She then got a scarf, which is called a sari, and the Indian ladies wore these scarves, and she put it around her head, and she wore it over her head like this, and she was able to cover her mouth and go out into the marketplace, and she was disguised. And she said to her missionary friends that she was living with, what do you think? Would anybody know that I was Irish? Would anybody know that I wasn't Indian? And her friend said, yes, that's a really good disguise. And one of her friends said to her, Amy, it's a really good job that you have brown eyes instead of blue eyes. And Amy thought to herself, oh, you're right. And she thought back to her prayer when she was a little girl, and when she prayed that God would give her blue eyes instead of brown eyes. And Amy realized that God's answer to her prayer was the right answer, because God knew that one day Amy would be a missionary in India. God had a very special job for her to do. You see, if Amy had have had those blue eyes, even when she was disguised, people would know that she was not from India. Her life could have been in danger. The work that she was going to do for God was going to be dangerous work. And she needed to have brown eyes. God's answer was the best answer. Maybe you're praying for something and God has said no. Maybe God has told you to wait because it's just not the right time for God to answer your prayer. Or maybe God says yes. You know, God knows you. God loves you. He knows everything about you. He knows what you will do in the future. He knows the right answers to your prayers. And God's answers are always the best answers, because he is a good and a loving God, and his plans for us are always good, and they're always loving, and God always gives the best. And so Amy knew that day that God's answer to her prayer as a little girl of 3 years old was the right answer. Well, Amy went out into the marketplace disguised. She had her scarf around her. She had her skin stained with coffee. And she went out into the marketplace and she went into the temple. She walked right in past the priests, and they hadn't even noticed her, didn't even look at her. And as she walked in, she could hear this music. And the music was quite loud. But as she walked in, it was very dark. It was damp. It was a bit smelly. And there were shadows all over the walls. There were candles lit everywhere. And right in front of her was this big statue. This was one of the gods that the people worshipped. They would come into the temple, they would burn incense, they would pray, and they would worship to these gods. And Amy felt so sad. She thought, these statues aren't real. They're false gods. These people really needed to hear about the true and the living God. They needed to hear about Jesus. Amy felt so sad as she left the temple that day, knowing that there were so many people who were blinded by this religion, who believed that these false gods could hear and answer their prayers, and yet they were just statues. Well, one day Amy went out into the marketplace again, and as she walked out into the marketplace, walking down the street, she could see this wooden cart. On this wooden cart there was a statue, one of the temple gods, and sitting around this statue there were little girls dressed in purple silk dresses. They had white flowers in their hair. Their hair was oily and had perfume on it, and they had these gold bangles on their arms, gold jewellery. And Amy wondered where these girls were going to. They were all sitting around the statue, and as Amy looked into their faces, she could see that they were really afraid. They were really scared. These little girls were going into the temple, and Amy knew that they were going in there and they would stay there forever. You know, as she stood there watching the cart, the temple gates opened wide, the big wooden gates, and the cart went right in, and the doors just shut behind the cart. And Amy stood there looking at the gates, and she felt helpless. Here she was, a young Irish girl in this big country. In this country where thousands and millions of people went into the temples to worship these false gods. What could she do? She was just one person standing there outside the gates. But Amy knew that God was with her. She knew that God hears and answers prayer. She knew that with God nothing was impossible because He is the all-powerful God. She knew that God is strongest of all. She knew that God could make a way, that He is the God who does miracles. And as Amy stood there, she prayed. She asked God to show her what to do next. Amy wanted to rescue these temple children. She wanted to tell them about Jesus. She wanted to tell them that they could have their sins forgiven, that they could have this new life. And as she stood there, she prayed. She knew that God could hear and answer her prayers. She knew that God would always give the best answers. But how would she rescue these children? Would she be able to rescue any? Well, you'll have to wait to find out.
We're now going to sing the song Ask, Seek, Knock.
I'm reading my B.I.B. early, and this is what it says to me. It tells me that I'm never ever alone. I'm learning how Jesus came down to us and gave His best. Without a doubt, the best friend you'll ever know. Our God knows exactly what I need, so I remember this. Let's go! When you ask, He cares. When you seek, He's there. When you knock, 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 God opens up the door. When you ask, He cares. When you seek, He's there. When you knock, 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 God opens up the door. I'm reading my B.I.B. early, and this is what it says to me. It tells me that I'm never ever alone. I'm learning how Jesus came down to us and gave His best. Without a doubt, the best friend you'll ever know. Our God knows exactly what I need, so I remember this. Let's go! When you ask, He cares. When you seek, He's there. When you knock, 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 God opens up the door. When you ask, He cares. When you seek, He's there. When you knock, 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 God opens up the door. Oh, whoa. When you ask, He cares. When you seek, He's there. When you knock, 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 God opens up the door. When you ask, He cares. When you seek, He's there. When you knock, 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 God opens up the door. God knows exactly what I need, so I remember this. Let's go. When you ask, He cares.
Wow, that was so exciting, wasn't it, Charlie?
Yeah.
It really was. What lesson did we learn today?
That God answers prayers.
And He does. Sometimes He says yes, sometimes He says no, and sometimes He just wants us to wait. Well, you'll have to come back again to find out what else happens to Amy. Bye.
Bye.